The Vampire King was buying groceries like any normal person when Ethan broke from Sarah's grip and called him Daddy. Security cameras captured everything. What they didn't know was that the boy's innocent words just triggered a centuries-old prophecy, and Sarah's quiet life was about to become a battleground. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, Ethan's chatter about the nice man with pretty eyes filling the silence between her racing thoughts. The business card felt heavy in her pocket, its expensive weight somehow matching the gravity she'd felt when those midnight blue eyes met hers. Adrian Blackthorne. The name rolled through her mind like distant thunder, carrying echoes she couldn't place. At every red light, she found herself glancing in the rearview mirror, searching for something she couldn't name among the ordinary traffic flowing behind them. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store still seemed to flicker in her peripheral vision, and she couldn't shake the memory of that moment when the entire world had seemed to hold its breath. Ethan had called a complete stranger Daddy, and instead of the awkward embarrassment she'd expected, something had shifted in the air itself, like the moment before lightning strikes when every hair on your body stands on end. Their modest apartment building came into view, its faded brick facade a stark contrast to the sleek modernity of downtown where they'd just been. Sarah parked in her assigned spot, noting the broken security light she'd been meaning to report to the landlord for weeks. As she unbuckled Ethan from his car seat, his small hands reached up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. "Mommy, why did the pretty-eyed man feel like home?" he asked, his 4-year-old vocabulary struggling with concepts that seemed too large for his small frame. Sarah's heart stuttered at the question, because she'd felt it too, that inexplicable sense of recognition, as if meeting Adrian Blackthorne had been a homecoming rather than a chance encounter. She carried Ethan up the narrow stairs, his weight familiar against her hip, but her mind kept drifting back to the way Adrian had knelt to Ethan's level, with fluid grace that seemed almost otherworldly. The man's touch on Ethan's shoulder had been gentle, protective, and Sarah had glimpsed something in his expression that looked like wonder mixed with ancient sadness. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Once inside their small apartment, Sarah set Ethan up with his coloring books while she put away groceries, her movements automatic as her thoughts churned. The business card emerged from her pocket like a talisman, its matte black surface embossed with silver lettering that caught the light in subtle ways. Blackthorne Industries. She'd heard the name before, whispered in the hallways of the hospital where she worked, associated with generous anonymous donations and state-of-the-art equipment that appeared without fanfare. Her laptop hummed to life on the small kitchen table, and she found herself typing Adrian's name into the search engine with fingers that moved almost without conscious direction. The results were surprisingly sparse for someone who apparently controlled a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Professional headshots showed a man of striking beauty, his dark hair and pale skin giving him an almost classical appearance, but it was his eyes that drew her attention in every image. Those same midnight blue depths that had seemed to see straight through her in the grocery store, that had made her feel exposed and understood in equal measure. There were mentions of charitable foundations, renewable energy initiatives, and historical preservation projects, but nothing personal, nothing that explained the magnetic pull she'd felt, or the way Ethan had recognized him instantly. Miles away, in a glass tower that scraped the belly of storm clouds gathering over the city, Marcus Thorne rewound the security footage for the 7th time. His fingers drummed against the polished conference table as he studied every frame of the encounter. His centuries of experience reading supernatural signs, screaming warnings that made his ancient blood run cold. The child's innocent proclamation had triggered something that no vampire had witnessed in living memory. A golden light that pulsed through the boy's veins like liquid sunlight. Marcus had served on the Vampire Council for 300 years, had seen the rise and fall of empires, had watched as prophecies proved themselves true or false with the passage of time, But this was different. This was the awakening that their oldest texts spoke of in whispers, the moment when the sleeping power in their king's bloodline would stir to life through the recognition of an innocent heart. He reached for his secure phone, knowing that within the hour, every supernatural faction in the city would receive word of what had transpired in that mundane grocery store. The child had called the vampire king Daddy, and the ancient magic had responded with a display that would reshape the balance of power across all their hidden worlds. Victoria Ashford stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, her reflection a pale ghost against the darkening sky. She'd built her power base carefully over the decades, weaving alliances and debts into a web that stretched across the supernatural community like silver thread. Adrian's weakness for humans had always been her greatest weapon against him. The soft spot she could exploit when political maneuvering required a more personal touch. But this changed everything. The footage Marcus had shared showed not weakness, but awakening. Not vulnerability, but the first stirrings of a power that could unite or destroy everything they'd built. Her reflection smiled back at her, an expression that held no warmth, only calculation. If she could control the child, she could control the prophecy. If she could eliminate him, she could prevent Adrian from accessing the full extent of his birthright. Either path led to the same destination, with Victoria standing at the apex of supernatural society, while Adrian's human sympathies crumbled to dust beneath the weight of political necessity. In the underground tunnels beneath the city's industrial district, Dante Rossi paced the length of his PAX meeting chamber like a caged wolf. The phone call had come 30 minutes ago, Marcus Thorne's voice carefully neutral as he delivered news that would ripple through the supernatural community like an earthquake. The vampire king's heir had awakened, a human child whose innocent recognition had triggered the very prophecy that werewolf shamans had warned about for generations. Dante's pack had maintained their territory through careful balance, never strong enough to challenge vampire supremacy, but never weak enough to be absorbed or eliminated. A prophecy-empowered vampire king threatened that delicate equilibrium, potentially tipping the scales toward absolute vampire dominion. His lieutenants gathered around the scarred wooden table that had hosted pack councils for over a century. Their expressions grim as they contemplated a future where their ancient autonomy might be nothing more than a memory. The moon child their own prophecies spoke of was supposed to end the enmity between vampires and werewolves, but Dante had lived long enough to know that prophecies could be interpreted in many ways, not all of them leading to the peace their shamans promised. Sarah found herself staring at Adrian's business card long after Ethan had fallen asleep, the silver lettering seeming to pulse with its own light in the dim glow of her laptop screen. She'd researched until her eyes burned, following digital threads that led to more questions than answers. Blackthorn Industries had appeared in the business world 15 years ago, but its CEO seemed ageless in photos spanning that entire period. There were no family connections listed, no personal details beyond professional accomplishments, nothing that explained the sense of familiarity that had struck her like lightning in that grocery store. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Maria, asking about weekend plans, and Sarah realized she couldn't explain what had happened without sounding like she'd lost her mind. How could she tell anyone that her 4-year-old son had recognized a stranger as family, that she'd felt the world shift when that stranger's eyes met hers, that something fundamental had changed in those few moments among the produce displays? She closed the laptop and checked on Ethan one more time, finding him sleeping peacefully with a smile that suggested pleasant dreams. In the morning, she would return to her normal routine, to the hospital shifts and weekend catering jobs that kept their small family afloat. But even as she made that promise to herself, she knew that normal had been left behind in aisle 7 of a downtown grocery store. Adrian stood in his study, surrounded by artifacts that spanned nearly 9 centuries of existence, while Willem moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had served the same master for over 200 years. The ancient protective wards carved into the estate's foundation stones pulsed with renewed energy, their magic responding to the awakening power that now flowed through Adrian's veins like molten gold. He'd felt the change the moment the child's small arms wrapped around his legs, the instant when innocent recognition had triggered magic that had slumbered since his transformation in the blood-soaked fields of the Holy Land. The prophecy had been whispered in his ear by a dying witch as crusader swords cut down everything he'd once held dear. Her final gift, a promise that his sacrifice would someday bear fruit in the form of a bridge between worlds. 8 centuries he'd waited, protecting the innocent when he could, building power and influence while never forgetting the human he'd once been. Willem paused in his organization of ancient texts, his weathered face reflecting concerns that came from decades of witnessing his master navigate the treacherous currents of supernatural politics. The boy's awakening would draw attention from every faction in the hidden world, he observed quietly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries spent watching empires rise and fall. Adrian nodded, his attention fixed on the window that looked out over a city filled with both the innocent and the predatory. The child and his mother would need protection, not just from supernatural threats, but from the human authorities who could be so easily manipulated by those with enough influence and resources. Victoria's visit was inevitable, as was the council's demand that he bring the boy before them for evaluation and registration. But Adrian had not survived 8 centuries by allowing others to dictate the terms of his existence. And he would not begin now when the stakes involved an innocent child and a woman whose courage in the face of the impossible had awakened something in his ancient heart that he'd thought lost forever. The secure phone's harsh ring cut through the evening silence like a blade. Adrian answered without checking the caller identification, knowing that only a handful of beings possessed this particular number. Victoria's voice poured through the speaker like honey laced with poison, her words carefully chosen to convey both seduction and threat in equal measure. She spoke of council meetings and political necessities, of the delicate balance that kept their kind safe from human discovery, of the responsibilities that came with power, and the consequences of choosing personal desires over collective security. Adrian listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of the cold fury building in his chest. When she finished her carefully crafted monologue with an invitation to discuss matters privately at her penthouse, Adrian's response carried the weight of absolute authority. "The child is under my protection," he said simply, each word falling into the silence like stones into deep water, "as is his mother." The line went quiet for a heartbeat before Victoria's laughter rippled through the speaker, a sound like breaking glass that promised future storms. "How romantic," she purred, her voice dropping to register that had once stirred his blood but now left him cold. "How human of you. The council will interpret that as choosing mortals over your own kind." Again. Adrian ended the call without responding, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. His phone buzzed immediately with a text from an unknown number, the message consisting of a single photograph that made his supernatural senses flare with protective rage. Sarah's apartment building, captured in high resolution that showed every detail of the modest structure where she and Ethan were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their lives had become the center of a supernatural storm that was only beginning to gather strength. Adrian moved through his estate with inhuman speed, gathering resources and making preparations for a conflict that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of a child whose innocent recognition had awakened powers that could reshape the balance between all the hidden worlds that existed in the shadows of human civilization. The prophecy had begun, and there would be no turning back from the path that innocent word Daddy had set in motion beneath the fluorescent lights of a downtown grocery store. Sarah's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs as the apartment's security alarm shrieked its electronic warning into the silence that had been her peaceful sleep just moments before. She stumbled from her bed, bare feet hitting cold hardwood as she rushed to check on Ethan, finding him sitting upright in his small bed with eyes that seemed far too alert for a 4-year-old awakened from sleep. Mommy, the shadow people were watching me again, he whispered, his small voice carrying a certainty that made Sarah's skin crawl even as her rational mind insisted it was just another nightmare brought on by yesterday's strange encounter at the grocery store. She gathered him into her arms, feeling his solid warmth against her chest as she carried him through their modest apartment, checking each room with growing confusion because nothing appeared disturbed, nothing stolen or broken. Yet the security system continued its insistent wailing until she punched in the code with trembling fingers. The silence that followed felt heavier than the alarm's cacophony, pregnant with possibilities that Sarah's practical nurse training refused to acknowledge, even as something deeper, more primitive, whispered warnings that made her check the locks twice and peer through the peephole at an empty hallway that somehow felt less empty than it appeared. Morning brought no relief from the unease that had settled over Sarah like a shroud, and she found herself examining their small balcony garden with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. The tomato plants she'd been nurturing showed no signs of disturbance. The herbs continued their steady growth toward the autumn sun, but there in the soft soil between the planters were impressions that made her breath catch in her throat. Footprints that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, as if the very earth had been touched by something that existed in defiance of natural law. Sarah knelt beside them, her fingers hovering just above the strange marks, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. These weren't the prints of any human intruder, weren't the paw marks of some large dog that had somehow accessed their third-floor balcony. They were something else entirely, something that her mind struggled to categorize, even as every instinct screamed that they represented a threat to everything she held dear. Ethan appeared beside her with the silent grace that sometimes unnerved her, his small hand slipping into hers as he stared down at the mysterious impressions, with an understanding that seemed far beyond his years. "The bad things were here, Mommy," he said simply, his voice carrying a matter-of-fact acceptance that made Sarah's protective instincts flare like a struck match. She pulled him back inside, locking the balcony door with hands that shook despite her efforts to maintain calm, and reached for her phone to call the police, even though she had no idea how to explain what she'd found. Adrian's arrival at her door interrupted the call before she could complete it, his appearance so sudden and silent that Sarah wondered how he'd gotten past the building's security systems. His hand moved with inhuman speed to gently press the phone closed, his midnight blue eyes holding an intensity that made her feel exposed and protected in equal measure. "There are things the human authorities cannot handle," he said, his cultured voice carrying undertones of ancient authority that made her apartment feel smaller, more fragile, as if his very presence strained the boundaries of her ordinary world. "Your son has attracted attention from forces beyond their understanding," he continued, stepping inside without invitation, but somehow making the intrusion feel like salvation rather than violation. Sarah's rational mind rebelled against the implications of his words, against the suggestion that the strange footprints and Ethan's claims about shadow people were connected to something larger and more dangerous than her practical worldview could accommodate. But even as she opened her mouth to protest, to demand explanations that made sense in the context of her carefully ordered life, Ethan broke free from her protective grip and ran to Adrian with the unshakable conviction of absolute recognition. "Daddy," Ethan said again, the word carrying the same innocent certainty that had turned their world upside down in the grocery store. And when Adrian knelt to catch the small boy in his arms, Sarah watched in stunned silence as faint golden light emanated from her son's skin, like captured sunlight. The illumination pulsed with each heartbeat, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood on a level that bypassed conscious thought. Adrian's expression as he held Ethan revealed emotions that spoke of centuries rather than days, loneliness and wonder and protective fierce that transformed his classical features into something both beautiful and terrible. "What is he?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own thundering pulse as she watched her son's eyes briefly flash with wisdom that belonged to ages rather than 4 short years of life. "The bridge between worlds," Adrian replied, his usual composed demeanor cracking to reveal depths of feeling that made Sarah realize how carefully he'd been controlling himself during their previous encounter. "And my heir," he added, the words falling into the silence like stones into deep water, creating ripples that Sarah knew would reshape everything she thought she understood about reality itself. The drive to Adrian's estate passed in a blur of impossible revelations and mounting questions that seemed to multiply faster than they could be answered. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of a car that moved with supernatural silence through streets that seemed to bend and shift around them, while Ethan chattered happily from his car seat about the pretty lights he could see dancing around Adrian's hands on the steering wheel. The estate itself defied her expectations, a modernist fortress of glass and steel that seemed to grow from the hillside like something organic, its clean lines softened by gardens that shouldn't have been able to flourish in the approaching autumn, but bloomed with impossible vitality nonetheless. Adrian led them through rooms that felt larger than their external dimensions should have allowed, past windows that showed views of landscapes that couldn't possibly exist in the geography she knew, until they reached a study lined with artifacts that spoke of centuries rather than decades of collecting. Here, surrounded by scrolls and books and objects that seemed to hum with their own internal energy, Adrian began to reveal the hidden architecture of the world Sarah had thought she understood. Vampires, werewolves, witches, and other beings she'd relegated to the realm of fiction maintained a delicate balance of power that stretched back through recorded history and beyond, their conflicts and alliances shaping human events from the shadows in ways that mortal historians had never suspected. The prophecy that centered on Ethan spoke of a child born of Adrian's bloodline who would either unite these factions in peace or grant their ruler absolute dominion over both supernatural and human realms. A bridge between worlds that could heal ancient wounds or tear reality itself apart, depending on the choices made in the crucible of his awakening power. "Ethan is descended from my human family," Adrian explained, spreading ancient genealogical records across a table whose surface seemed to shift and change to accommodate the yellowed parchments and hand-drawn family trees. "The magic recognized what science could not," he continued, tracing lines that connected Sarah's lineage back through generations to a sister Adrian had loved and lost when the Crusades took everything human from his existence. Sarah stared at the carefully preserved documents with growing disbelief, recognizing family names that her late husband David had mentioned during his obsessive research into their heritage. Research she'd thought was merely an academic hobby, but now understood had been something far more urgent and purposeful. David had been trying to warn her, she realized with a grief that cut fresh and deep. Her beloved husband's late nights, spent poring over genealogical websites and historical documents, now revealed as desperate attempts to understand the supernatural legacy that ran in their family blood. The car accident that had taken him 2 years prior suddenly seemed less random, more targeted, and Sarah felt the first stirrings of a rage that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with protective fury for the son who had inherited more than just David's dark eyes and stubborn chin. Ethan demonstrated his budding abilities with the casual ease of a child showing off a new toy, sensing the emotions that flowed between the adults in the room like visible currents, seeing through the careful masks that Adrian wore to appear more human and less like the predator he'd been shaped into by centuries of survival. Most remarkably, when Ethan touched Sarah's hand and asked her to tell him about Daddy David, she found herself compelled to share memories she'd never spoken aloud, truths about her grief and fear and desperate love for her son that poured from her lips without conscious permission. These powers grew stronger around Adrian, their bond creating feedback loops of supernatural energy that made the air itself seem to thicken with possibility and danger. The first strike came not through supernatural assassins or ancient vendettas, but through the mundane machinery of human bureaucracy, wielded with surgical precision by enemies who had spent centuries learning to manipulate mortal institutions for their own purposes. Social services arrived at Sarah's apartment while she was still processing the revelations in Adrian's study, armed with anonymous tips and doctored evidence that painted her as an unfit mother struggling with drug addiction and neglect. The investigators who swarmed through her modest home found planted evidence with the efficiency of people who believed they were saving an innocent child from a dangerous situation. Their genuine concern making them perfect, unwitting weapons in Victoria's carefully orchestrated campaign. Legal proceedings began with breathtaking speed, paperwork filed, and hearings scheduled with the kind of efficiency that only came from having judges and social workers already in position to rubber stamp decisions that had been made in boardrooms rather than courtrooms. Sarah watched her world crumble from Adrian's estate, receiving updates through phone calls that brought news of frozen bank accounts, suspended nursing licenses, and custody hearings that had been fast-tracked through a system that normally moved with glacial slowness. Fighting through human legal channels revealed itself as hopeless against enemies who controlled vast resources and had centuries of experience manipulating mortal institutions. Their influence extending through networks of wealth and power that made Sarah's working-class background feel like a death sentence in a war she didn't understand how to fight. Adrian offered sanctuary at his estate with the gravity of someone who understood the full implications of what he was proposing, his midnight eyes holding depths of regret as he explained that accepting meant abandoning her human life entirely and trusting a being she'd known for days with her son's future. Sarah hesitated, torn between the practical impossibility of fighting supernatural enemies through mortal courts and the terrifying prospect of placing her complete trust in someone whose true nature remained largely mysterious despite his obvious care for Ethan. The decision was made for her when werewolf assassins, hired by a faction that wanted to eliminate the prophesied child entirely rather than risk the changes his existence might bring, attacked her apartment building with the coordinated precision of military operatives. Adrian arrived as they were scaling the building's exterior walls, moving with inhuman speed that turned him into a blur of motion and shadow against the evening sky. Sarah watched from the balcony as he intercepted the attackers with displays of power that shattered her remaining illusions about the world being a place governed by natural law and human limitations. Supernatural speed allowed him to move between opponents faster than her eyes could follow. Ancient strength let him tear through reinforced materials like tissue paper. And most terrifyingly, his command over shadows turned the approaching darkness into a weapon that responded to his will like an extension of his own body. The werewolves fought with desperate ferocity, their partially transformed states granting them enhanced strength and speed. But they were no match for a vampire king whose power had been awakened by the recognition of his prophesied heir. When Adrian's eyes met those of the surviving assassin, the creature's fierce resistance crumbled into absolute obedience, compelled by supernatural authority that brooked no defiance or hesitation. "Come with me now," Adrian commanded, as sirens wailed in the distance, and Sarah realized that human authorities would find crime scene evidence that raised questions she could never answer, or lose him forever. His hand extended toward her carried the weight of absolute choice, the final moment when her old life ended and whatever came next began in earnest. Sarah looked down at Ethan, who watched the supernatural combat with the calm acceptance of a child whose world had always included magic and monsters. Then back at Adrian, whose expression held promises of protection and transformation in equal measure. She took his hand, feeling the cool strength of fingers that had touched centuries of history, and sealed her fate with a choice that felt less like surrender than like finally accepting a destiny that had been written in her blood before she was born. The world blurred around them as Adrian's power swept them away from the life she'd built through determination and hard work toward a future that promised wonders and terrors in measures she couldn't begin to calculate, but which offered the one thing she needed more than safety or certainty: the chance to protect her son from enemies who would use his innocent power for purposes that had nothing to do with the bridge between worlds he was meant to become. Sarah's first morning in Adrian's estate began with the disorienting discovery that the sun rising outside her bedroom window cast light that seemed softer than natural physics should allow, filtered through glass that held subtle prismatic qualities, suggesting the barrier between inside and outside involved more than simple transparency. She had fallen asleep in a guest room decorated in calming earth tones, but awakening revealed walls that had shifted to display frescoes depicting scenes from what appeared to be her own childhood memories, images she was certain hadn't been there when exhaustion finally claimed her the night before. The estate existed partially outside normal reality, she would learn, as Willem guided her through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves based on need, protected by wards that blended architecture with magic in ways that made her former understanding of fixed space feel like a quaint limitation. Rooms appeared when required and vanished when no longer needed. The modernist mansions sitting on grounds that stretched toward horizons that couldn't possibly exist within the geographical constraints of the hillside. She remembered driving up just hours earlier. The library contained books that wrote themselves, their pages filling with text as she watched, recording conversations happening in distant parts of the house, or documenting events that hadn't yet occurred, but somehow felt inevitable in the strange logic of this place that defied every natural law she'd once accepted as immutable truth. Willem appeared at her door with the silent efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of supernatural domestic service across centuries of practice, his appearance that of a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, though his eyes held depths that suggested far greater age and experience. He carried a breakfast tray laden with foods that somehow perfectly matched preferences she hadn't expressed. And when she asked how he could possibly have known her exact coffee preparation ritual, his gentle smile held secrets that felt both comforting and slightly unsettling. Centuries old himself, and turned to serve as Adrian's human liaison, Willem explained the estate's rules with the patience of someone who had guided countless confused mortals through their first exposure to supernatural reality. Certain rooms were forbidden during daylight hours, their contents or occupants requiring the protection of darkness for reasons that involved politics and safety measures Sarah wasn't yet prepared to fully understand. Mirrors throughout the house must be covered during new moons when reflective surfaces became potential gateways for entities that viewed human thoughts as particularly appetizing delicacies. Most importantly, Ethan must never be left alone with any visitor, no matter how trusted or politically necessary, because the child's awakening power made him a target for factions whose intentions ranged from protective custody to something far more sinister and permanent. The greenhouse revealed flowers that bloomed only in moonlight, their petals luminescent with colors that existed nowhere in natural spectrums, while the nursery that had been prepared for Ethan displayed toys and books that responded to his emotional state by shifting their forms and contents to match his immediate interests and developmental needs. Sarah watched her son interact with these impossible objects with the easy acceptance of childhood, building castles from blocks that reassembled themselves into increasingly complex architectural marvels, and reading picture books whose illustrations moved and changed to tell different stories based on his attention span and curiosity. The rooms designed for her comfort felt like a luxurious prison, beautiful and accommodating, but fundamentally isolating from the world she'd spent 28 years learning to navigate through determination and practical skills that seemed laughably inadequate in this context. Every decision now required filtering through supernatural concerns that transformed simple choices into complex calculations involving protective spells, political implications, and safety measures that made buying groceries feel like planning a military operation in hostile territory. She couldn't contact her sister Maria without risking exposure that might bring human authorities or enemy factions to investigate a family connection that would put her remaining loved ones in danger. Returning to work was impossible when her nursing license had been suspended, and her former life dismantled by enemies who controlled resources and influenced networks that stretched through every level of mortal society. Even purchasing new clothes for Ethan required considerations about whether fabrics contained iron threads that might interfere with protective spells or synthetic materials that could conduct supernatural energies in ways that compromised the estate's carefully maintained defenses. Sarah found herself mourning not just her independence, but the simple certainty of a world governed by rules she understood, where problems had logical solutions and protective instincts could be satisfied through locks and alarm systems, rather than ancient magic and political maneuvering that spanned centuries of supernatural grudges and alliances. Marcus Thorne's arrival shattered the fragile peace of their sanctuary, like a stone through glass, his presence announcing itself through changes in the estate's atmosphere that made the air itself feel heavier and more charged with potential conflict. Adrian received the council's official representative in the Grand Hall, a space that revealed its true proportions only when needed for formal supernatural diplomacy. Its soaring ceilings and classical columns, speaking of power and permanence, that dwarfed human architectural ambitions. Sarah watched from a hidden alcove that Willem had shown her, a viewing space designed for occasions when mortal observers needed to witness supernatural politics without becoming direct participants in negotiations that could turn deadly without warning. Marcus presented the council's ultimatum with the grave formality of someone delivering terms that had been debated and refined through endless political sessions, his centuries of loyalty to vampire law creating internal conflict that showed in the tightness around his eyes as he spoke words that felt like betrayal of principles he'd once held sacred. The council demanded that Ethan be brought before the full assembly for proper evaluation and registration, their terms delivered with the careful precision of lawyers who had spent decades crafting agreements that appeared reasonable while concealing trap clauses and hidden obligations. The child would be raised within the supernatural community under council guidance, trained to understand his abilities through curriculum designed to shape his worldview toward vampire interests, and eventually pledged to serve those interests above all others, including human welfare or personal conscience. In exchange, Sarah would be granted immortality through vampire transformation and a place within their hierarchy, a position that sounded generous, until the implications became clear that she would become another asset, controlled by the same forces seeking to claim her son. Adrian's response carried the weight of absolute authority, ancient power, making the very air vibrate with menace as he declared that the child was not chattel to be bargained for, like a piece of valuable property transferred between collectors who saw him only as a means to greater power and influence. Marcus countered with the political reality that Ethan's existence changed everything about supernatural balance, his awakening power representing a catalyst that could unite or destroy factions that had maintained uneasy truces for centuries through careful negotiations and shared understanding of mutual destruction. The council would not allow such power to develop unchecked, he continued, because prophecies had a way of fulfilling themselves in directions that served the interests of whoever controlled their key figures during crucial developmental periods. Victoria's entrance shifted the confrontation's tone from formal diplomacy to something far more dangerous, her beauty and grace concealing predatory instincts that had been honed through decades of supernatural politics, where weakness meant death and hesitation meant losing everything to rivals who showed no mercy for sentiment or humanitarian concerns. She brought news that werewolf and witch factions were mobilizing, viewing the prophecy as a threat to supernatural balance that required either absolute control or complete elimination to preserve the status quo that had kept their hidden world stable through careful management of competing interests. War seemed inevitable unless the council could demonstrate control over the situation, Victoria explained, with the satisfaction of someone who had helped engineer the very crisis she now proposed to solve through measures that would consolidate her own power while eliminating Adrian's human attachments. Her smile carried promises and threats in equal measure as she detailed intelligence about enemy movements and faction alliances that painted a picture of supernatural civil war with Ethan as the prize that would determine victory or defeat for all participants. Sarah listened from her hidden vantage point with growing horror as she realized that her son had become the center of conflicts that stretched back centuries, his innocent recognition of Adrian in a grocery store having triggered political machinations that could reshape or destroy everything the supernatural world had built through millennia of careful evolution and adaptation. Sarah's own transformation began subtly, with enhanced perceptions that she initially attributed to stress and the heightened awareness that came from living in constant danger. She found herself seeing auras around the estate's inhabitants, subtle energy fields that revealed emotional states and supernatural natures in ways that made deception impossible to maintain. Adrian's aura pulsed with ancient power and carefully controlled predatory instincts, while Willem's showed the complex layering of human memories overlaid with vampire transformation and centuries of devoted service that had shaped his personality into something unprecedented in supernatural society. Ethan's aura blazed like captured sunlight, his developing abilities creating patterns that seemed to write themselves in languages that existed before human speech but somehow conveyed meaning directly to her consciousness, without requiring translation or interpretation. The prophetic dreams began sharing themselves between mother and son, creating a connection that allowed Sarah to witness possible futures through Ethan's sleeping mind, while adding her own maternal perspective to visions that showed the full scope of what her son might become. Some dreams revealed him as a bridge builder between species, his innocent wisdom helping ancient enemies find common ground, and shared purposes that transcended centuries of mutual hatred and competition. Others showed him as a tyrant ruling over human cattle, his power corrupted by supernatural politics and the constant pressure of being treated as a weapon rather than a child who deserved love and protection above all other considerations. Most terrifyingly, some visions showed Ethan dead while supernatural factions warred over his corpse, his potential squandered through the short-sighted greed of adults who saw him only as a means to their own ends rather than a person worthy of life and happiness, regardless of his usefulness to their political ambitions. The attack came at dawn, when the estate's defenses were transitioning between night and day configurations, witch assassins breaching the outer wards through magic that turned the morning mist into concealing smoke, and the garden's protective plants into allies that bent away from their approach. Sarah was feeding Ethan breakfast when the first explosion shook the house, the estate's alarm systems triggering responses that sealed doors and activated barriers designed to contain supernatural threats until Adrian could respond with lethal force. She gathered Ethan into her arms and ran toward the safe room Willem had shown her, but the assassins moved with inhuman speed through corridors that should have been protected by magic older than most human civilizations. When the first witch appeared in the nursery doorway, her hands crackling with destructive energy that could unmake flesh and bone at the molecular level, Sarah's only thought was protecting her son, regardless of personal cost, or the logical impossibility of a human mother stopping supernatural assassins through willpower alone. Her protective instincts triggered something that had been dormant in her bloodline for generations, power that exploded outward from her body in waves of golden fire that turned the attacking witches to ash before they could complete their killing spells. The display of raw magical force alarmed even Adrian, who arrived to find Sarah standing in the center of destruction, with golden light still crackling around her fingers like captured lightning that responded to her emotional state rather than any conscious control or training. "What am I becoming?" she demanded, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before, undertones of power that made the estate's protective wards resonate in sympathy with her distress and confusion. "Something the prophecy never mentioned," Adrian admitted, fear and wonder warring in his expression as he recognized that Sarah's development represented an unprecedented factor that could change everything about their understanding of the forces that were reshaping the supernatural world through her son's awakening abilities. The city transformed into a supernatural battleground as representatives from every major faction converged on territory that had been neutral ground for decades, their competing interests turning familiar streets into potential war zones where ancient grudges and modern politics collided with devastating potential. Dante Rossi arrived with his werewolf pack under cover of darkness, their convoy of black vehicles moving through the industrial district with military precision that spoke of centuries spent surviving in a world that viewed their kind as either myths or monsters, depending on who was asking the questions. The werewolf Alpha sought alliance with Adrian against the Council's overreach, recognizing that vampire political machinations threatened the delicate balance that had allowed his people to maintain their territory and autonomy in the face of supernatural forces that viewed werewolves as useful but ultimately expendable assets in larger games of power and influence. Witch covens split between those who saw the prophecy as salvation, that would finally bring peace between warring supernatural factions, and those who viewed it as apocalypse, that would destroy the careful structures that had protected their kind from human discovery and vampire domination for countless generations. Ancient spirits and minor supernatural beings who normally remained neutral in factional conflicts found themselves forced to choose sides, turning every shadow into a potential battleground where invisible wars could erupt without warning between entities that mortal authorities could neither detect nor comprehend. Sarah ventured outside the estate's protection for the first time since the grocery store encounter that had shattered her ordinary life, accompanying Adrian to a neutral meeting ground that turned out to be a consecrated church whose sacred nature prevented supernatural violence through divine law that even the most powerful vampires respected. The Gothic cathedral's soaring spires and stained glass windows created an atmosphere of otherworldly beauty that seemed appropriate for negotiations that would determine the fate of beings who existed beyond normal human experience. Its consecrated ground serving as sanctuary, where ancient enemies could meet without fear of immediate assassination or magical attack. She witnessed the scope of the hidden world she'd become part of, as beings of myth and legend debated her son's fate, like generals planning a war, where the stakes involved not just territorial control or political supremacy, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. Vampires in expensive suits discussed Ethan's future with the cold calculation of corporate executives dividing assets, while werewolves in leather and denim argued for approaches that balanced protection with the freedom that their pack-based culture viewed as essential to healthy development. Witches draped in flowing robes that seemed to shift color based on their emotional states presented arguments rooted in prophecies that stretched back to the dawn of recorded history, their magic-enhanced voices carrying undertones that made normal conversation feel inadequate for discussions of such cosmic importance. Dante proved surprisingly sympathetic when he approached Sarah directly, his massive frame and scarred face concealing a gentleness that became apparent when he knelt to Ethan's level and spoke in tones that held respect rather than the calculated interest most supernatural beings showed toward the prophesied child. The werewolf Alpha revealed that his pack's prophecies spoke of a moon child who would end the ancient enmity between vampires and werewolves, his amber eyes holding centuries of hope for peace that had been passed down through generations who had lived with the constant threat of supernatural warfare. Ethan's ability to see truth extended to sensing the good intentions behind Dante's fierce exterior, the child's innocent wisdom recognizing authenticity in a world where political maneuvering and hidden agendas made honest communication nearly impossible. The werewolf's genuine concern for Ethan's well-being, rather than his potential usefulness, created an unexpected alliance that crossed species lines in ways that made the assembled vampires visibly uncomfortable with implications they couldn't control through traditional political pressure or supernatural authority. Sarah found herself grateful for Dante's presence as a voice of sanity in negotiations that seemed designed to treat her son like a valuable resource rather than a child who deserved protection and love, regardless of his prophetic significance. Victoria's trap revealed itself with the theatrical precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of political manipulation. Her presentation of forged evidence designed to undermine Sarah's credibility at the moment when supernatural consensus was most crucial to Adrian's political survival. The documents she produced suggested that David's death had been supernatural assassination rather than random accident, with Sarah as the intended target, whose survival had allowed enemy factions to place a compromised guardian in position to influence the prophesied child's development. The implications painted Sarah as either a willing collaborator with vampire enemies or an unwitting pawn whose emotional attachment to her son made her vulnerable to manipulation by forces that viewed Ethan's power as a weapon to be wielded against Adrian's faction. Victoria's performance combined genuine concern for supernatural security with calculated political theater, her beauty and grace lending credibility to accusations that forced the assembled representatives to question whether Sarah's protective instincts might actually represent a threat to the child they were ostensibly gathered to protect. The trap was elegantly constructed to appear logical and reasonable while concealing the ulterior motives that had nothing to do with Ethan's welfare and everything to do with eliminating Adrian's human connections that Victoria viewed as obstacles to her own ambitions for supernatural leadership. The accusation forced Adrian into an impossible choice between supporting Sarah and maintaining his political position within vampire hierarchy. The council's ultimatum delivered with the cold precision of beings who had spent centuries reducing complex emotional situations to simple calculations of power and advantage. They demanded that Sarah be mind-wiped and relocated to prevent further contamination of the prophesied child's development, while Ethan would be raised within vampire institutions under careful supervision that would shape his abilities toward purposes that served supernatural interests rather than human welfare or personal conscience. The assembled representatives watched with the detached interest of spectators at a gladiatorial contest as Adrian weighed his options, their ancient faces revealing no sympathy for the emotional turmoil that human attachments created in a world where sentiment was viewed as dangerous weakness. Victoria's satisfaction was carefully concealed but unmistakable to Sarah's newly enhanced perceptions, the vampire's aura revealing anticipation for a victory that would simultaneously eliminate a romantic rival and prove that Adrian's human sympathies made him unfit for the leadership responsibilities that she coveted with centuries of patient ambition and careful political maneuvering. Sarah's response stunned everyone present as she stood before an assembly of immortal beings and channeled the protective power that had manifested during the witch attack, her voice carrying supernatural authority that made the cathedral's ancient stones resonate with harmonics that spoke to magic older than recorded history. "You fear him because you see your own limitations," she declared, golden light beginning to emanate from her skin as maternal fury transformed into something that transcended normal human emotion to become a force of nature itself. "You see a child who might grow beyond your control, beyond your ancient hatreds and power games," she continued, her words gaining strength and supernatural resonance with each syllable. "But I see my son," she concluded, the simple statement carrying compulsion magic that forced truth from minds that had spent centuries perfecting the art of deception and political manipulation. Her untrained power cut through supernatural defenses like a sword through silk, bypassing magical protections and mental barriers that should have been impregnable to someone with no formal training in the mystical arts. The assembled representatives found themselves compelled to speak truths they had hidden even from themselves, their carefully constructed political positions crumbling under the weight of honest self-examination that revealed motivations rooted in fear rather than wisdom. One by one, they admitted their real reasons for seeking control over Ethan's development, ancient vampires confessing their terror that change would diminish their carefully accumulated power and influence. Werewolf elders acknowledged their desire to use the prophesied child as a weapon against centuries of vampire oppression, while witches revealed their fear that successful prophecy fulfillment would make their magical knowledge obsolete in a world where supernatural cooperation replaced the conflicts that had driven innovation and adaptation for millennia. Most devastating was the collective admission that they feared the prophecy might actually fulfill its promise of peace, which would render their ancient conflicts meaningless and force them to find new purposes for existences that had been defined by warfare and competition since their transformations into supernatural beings. The truth-telling created a cascade of revelations that stripped away political facades and revealed the petty motivations that drove immortal beings who possessed vast power but had somehow lost sight of the purposes that power was meant to serve. Ethan's power reached its first major milestone during the confrontation, triggered by his mother's emotional peak and the supernatural energies that filled the cathedral as ancient beings confronted truths they had spent centuries avoiding. The child's eyes blazed with golden fire that seemed to contain depths of wisdom accumulated across ages, his voice carrying echoes of every generation when he addressed the supernatural assembly, with authority that made their own claims to leadership seem hollow by comparison. "You fight over me like I'm a thing to be owned," he said, his words resonating through the cathedral with power that made the stained glass windows pulse with responsive light. "But the prophecy isn't about ruling," he continued, his innocent clarity cutting through centuries of accumulated political complexity to reveal fundamental truths that had been obscured by supernatural pride and ambition. "It's about choosing," he concluded, the simple statement triggering the blood awakening that had been foretold in prophecies, but never fully understood until this moment, when theory became devastating reality. The awakening manifested as a wave of truth-seeing that swept through the cathedral like purifying fire, stripping away all supernatural disguises and political pretenses to reveal every being present in their truest form for the first time in centuries. Vampires saw themselves clearly, recognizing how far they had drifted from the humans they had once been, and the protective purposes that had justified their transformation into predators who fed on the innocent they had sworn to defend. Werewolves witnessed their pack bonds revealed as both strength and limitation, their tribal loyalties creating insularity that prevented the cooperation necessary for genuine progress toward peace and mutual understanding. Witches experienced their magic as both gift and burden, their knowledge carrying responsibilities they had abdicated in favor of factional politics that served personal ambition rather than the greater good their powers were meant to protect and nurture. Adrian experienced the awakening most profoundly, witnessing visions of his human life that had been buried under centuries of vampire existence, his mortality revealed as precious rather than the weakness he had been taught to despise. He saw the gradual redemption that had begun when he first chose to protect rather than dominate, his growing capacity for love and sacrifice, marking a journey back toward the humanity he thought he had lost forever when Crusader swords had spilled his mortal blood on foreign soil. The power flowing between him and Ethan created a bond that transcended simple vampire hierarchy, their connection becoming a dyad of complementary abilities, where Adrian's ancient wisdom balanced Ethan's fresh perspective uncorrupted by supernatural politics and the cynicism that came from centuries of survival in a world that rewarded ruthlessness over compassion. Their merged auras blazed with combined light that transformed the cathedral's atmosphere, creating sanctuary that felt genuinely sacred rather than merely neutral ground established through divine law. Victoria's true nature revealed itself under the truth-seeing that her own machinations had triggered, the beautiful vampire facade cracking to expose the ancient entity that had been possessing her for decades without detection by supernatural authorities who should have recognized such fundamental deception. The creature that fed on supernatural conflict had been manipulating events to ensure eternal war between factions, its influence explaining the escalating tensions that had brought them all to this crisis point, where prophecy fulfillment seemed impossible without devastating bloodshed. The revelation turned former allies against her, as they recognized how their own conflicts had been orchestrated by something that viewed their suffering as entertainment and their destruction as necessary fuel for its continued existence. Victoria's escape in the chaos that followed her exposure came with promises of vengeance that carried the weight of supernatural oath-binding, her final words creating magical compulsions that would drive future conflicts until the entity found new hosts to continue its ancient work of preventing peace through the careful cultivation of hatred and mistrust between beings who might otherwise discover their common ground. The supernatural summit's aftermath sent shockwaves through the hidden world that reshaped political alignments with the force of tectonic plates shifting beneath centuries of established order, old alliances crumbling while new ones formed in response to the truth. Seeing that had stripped away diplomatic pretenses and revealed the genuine motivations driving immortal politics. Dante's werewolves formally allied with Adrian's vampire faction through blood oaths that bound their packs together in ways that transcended the traditional enmity between their species. Their shared recognition of Ethan's importance creating unprecedented cooperation between natural enemies who had spent millennia viewing each other as threats to be managed rather than potential allies in building a better future. Progressive witches led by the ancient matriarch Celeste Nightwhisper offered conditional support after witnessing Sarah's untrained power manifestation. Their scholarly interest in her unprecedented abilities balanced against centuries of caution regarding vampire political machinations that had often resulted in magical knowledge being weaponized for purposes that served supernatural dominance rather than the protection of innocent life. However, traditionalist factions within each group resisted these changes with the desperate fury of beings whose entire existence had been built upon maintaining conflicts that the new alliances threatened to resolve through cooperation and mutual understanding, rather than the careful balance of mutually assured destruction that had kept their world stable for so long. Sarah found herself thrust into a role she had never sought as the mother of prophecy, while simultaneously developing supernatural abilities that grew stronger with each passing day under the influence of proximity to both Adrian and Ethan, her protective instincts evolving into something that transcended normal human maternal love to become a force of nature capable of reshaping reality itself when her child's safety was threatened. Training sessions with Celeste took place in the estate's expanded gardens, where the ancient witch created controlled environments for Sarah to practice channeling her emerging powers. The matriarch's patient instruction revealing that Sarah's abilities stemmed from pure protective instinct, elevated to magical levels through bloodline connections that had been dormant for generations, until Ethan's awakening triggered their manifestation. She was becoming something unprecedented in supernatural history, Celeste explained with fascination that barely concealed deeper concerns about the implications. A human-born guardian whose strength matched her love for her child, and whose power seemed to operate independently of the traditional magical systems that governed witch abilities and vampire transformation. The discovery that Sarah's magic responded to emotional rather than intellectual triggers made training challenging, her protective instincts requiring real or perceived threats to manifest at full strength, while practice sessions felt artificial and limiting compared to the devastating force she had displayed during actual combat situations. Adrian struggled with the realization that his feelings for Sarah transcended political necessity, or the protective obligations that vampire law placed upon those who claimed responsibility for human dependence. Centuries of emotional detachment, making genuine love feel like dangerous vulnerability in a world where sentiment could be exploited by enemies who viewed compassion as weakness, to be targeted and destroyed. His vampire nature had been shaped by survival requirements that demanded cold calculation and strategic thinking. emotional connections representing potential leverage points that enemies could use to manipulate or destroy him through threats to those he cared about more than his own existence. But Ethan's influence created undeniable bonds between the three of them that felt more fundamental than the artificial family structures Adrian had observed during his centuries among human society. Their connection operating on levels that bypassed conscious choice to become something that felt inevitable and necessary for their individual development toward whatever destiny the prophecy intended. The emerging family dynamic challenged every assumption Adrian had maintained about vampire nature and the incompatibility between supernatural power and human emotional bonds, forcing him to reconsider whether his centuries of isolation had been necessary protection or unnecessary limitation that had prevented him from discovering the redemption that genuine love could offer. The emerging family dynamic faced its first serious test when Ethan began experiencing prophetic nightmares that shared themselves through the bond he maintained with both Sarah and Adrian, visions of possible futures that ranged from inspiring hope to terrifying despair, depending on the choices made by those who would shape his development during crucial formative years. Some visions promised peace and understanding between species as supernatural beings learned to see past ancient grudges and territorial conflicts toward shared goals that served all their interests better than the endless warfare that had defined their existence for millennia. Other nightmares revealed devastating wars where Ethan's power had been corrupted into a weapon of domination, his innocent desire to help others twisted by adults who saw him only as a means to achieve supremacy over both supernatural and human realms through force rather than the cooperation that his abilities were meant to facilitate. The most disturbing visions showed futures where the conflicts over his potential had destroyed him entirely, his death triggering supernatural civil wars that reduced both hidden and human worlds to rubble, while the survivors fought over the remaining scraps of civilization that their short-sightedness had failed to preserve. These prophetic experiences left Ethan exhausted and confused, his 4-year-old mind struggling to process concepts of war and peace that belonged to adult political understanding, while his developing abilities forced him to witness potential consequences of decisions he had no power to influence or control. Sarah's heart broke watching her son carry burdens that should have belonged to the immortal beings who claimed to understand the implications of prophecy fulfillment, while Adrian found himself questioning whether protecting Ethan meant isolating him from supernatural politics entirely, or preparing him to navigate them with wisdom and strength that could resist corruption from those who would use his power for selfish purposes. The nightmares created urgency around decisions that had seemed theoretical before, forcing them to confront the reality that Ethan's childhood was being shaped by forces beyond normal human experience, while time constraints prevented the gradual development that would have been ideal for helping him understand his abilities without being overwhelmed by their implications. Victoria's gambit revealed itself through a complex web of manipulation that demonstrated the entity possessing her had spent centuries perfecting the art of psychological warfare, her plan targeting not just Ethan directly, but the support network that gave Sarah strength to resist supernatural pressure and maintain her protective focus. Using stolen council resources that she had accumulated through decades of political maneuvering, Victoria created a network of human cultists who worshipped the ancient entity, possessing her without understanding the true nature of what they served, their desperate desire for meaning and purpose in ordinary lives making them perfect, unwitting weapons for supernatural manipulation. These cultists targeted Sarah's remaining human connections with surgical precision, approaching her sister Maria, former nursing colleagues, and even David's grieving parents with carefully crafted stories designed to awaken concern about Sarah's mental stability and Ethan's welfare in his mother's care. The cultists presented themselves as concerned citizens who had noticed troubling changes in Sarah's behavior, backed by forged evidence and expert testimony that painted her supernatural experiences as signs of psychological breakdown that posed dangers to an innocent child who deserved protection from his mother's delusions. Sarah's sister Maria arrived at the estate under the pretense of seeking reconciliation after their extended estrangement, her appearance triggering emotional responses that Sarah had suppressed during months of isolation from her former life and the relationships that had provided stability before supernatural politics consumed her existence. The reunion felt genuine at first, Maria's expressions of concern and offers of support seeming to represent the family connection that Sarah had missed desperately while adapting to her role as the mother of prophecy. But the curse hidden within Maria's innocent embrace was designed to transfer Ethan's protective bond from his mother to Victoria's entity, the magical manipulation so subtle that it almost succeeded before Ethan's truth sight revealed the deception that had corrupted his aunt's genuine love into a weapon aimed at destroying the family bonds that gave him strength to resist supernatural pressure. The discovery that Maria had been turned into an unwitting weapon against them created heartbreak that transcended simple betrayal, forcing Sarah to confront the reality that her remaining human connections had been compromised by enemies who would use love itself as a tool for gaining control over her son's developing abilities. The confrontation with the cursed Maria forced Sarah to use her protective power destructively for the first time, channeling the golden energy that had previously manifested only in defense of Ethan toward the purpose of burning away supernatural corruption that had infected her sister's mind and soul. The process required precise control that Sarah had not yet developed through training, her emotional state making it difficult to separate the curse from Maria's genuine personality and memories in ways that would preserve her sister's essential nature while eliminating the entity's influence. The magic that flowed through Sarah's hands felt like liquid fire as it sought out and destroyed the supernatural contamination, but the process left Maria with no memory of their reunion or the supernatural revelations that had brought her to the estate under false pretenses. The moral cost weighed heavily on Sarah's conscience, as she realized that saving Ethan had required erasing a part of her former life forever. Her sister's confused departure leaving behind questions that could never be answered without endangering Maria further through exposure to supernatural conflicts that she was better off not understanding. Adrian faced challenges to his leadership from within his own vampire hierarchy, as traditional factions led by the ancient Count Aldrich Draven viewed his human connections as weakness that compromised vampire supremacy and threatened the careful isolation that had protected their kind from human discovery for centuries. Count Draven represented old-school vampire politics that prioritized species dominance over cooperation with other supernatural beings, his faction arguing that Adrian's attachment to Sarah and Ethan made him unfit for leadership responsibilities that required ruthless decision-making, unclouded by sentimental concerns for mortal welfare. The traditionalists demanded that Adrian choose between his growing family and his crown, their ultimatum delivered with the ceremonial formality of beings who had spent centuries perfecting the rituals that governed vampire political succession and leadership challenges. They viewed the blood awakening not as an opportunity for supernatural evolution, but as a corruption of pure vampire nature that needed to be controlled or eliminated before it infected their entire species, with humanizing influences that would weaken them in conflicts with other supernatural factions who showed no similar restraint in pursuing their own interests. The challenge took the form of an ancient ritual combat that had been used for millennia to resolve disputes between vampire nobles when political negotiation failed to produce clear resolution, the victor claiming both the crown and the right to determine Ethan's future development according to their vision of what prophecy fulfillment should accomplish. Adrian accepted the challenge with the grim resignation of someone who recognized that refusing would only lead to civil war among his own people while accepting meant risking everything he had built with Sarah and Ethan on the outcome of single combat with an opponent whose centuries of experience made him a formidable adversary. The ritual took place in the estate's grand hall, its architecture expanding to accommodate supernatural combat, while protective wards shielded the observers from energies that could kill mortal witnesses through mere exposure to their intensity. Sarah and Ethan were forced to watch from protective circles that Adrian had insisted upon, despite their desire to remain closer to him during the combat. The magical barriers designed to contain the supernatural fallout that would inevitably result from centuries-old powers clashing with destructive force that could reshape the estate's very foundations. Count Draven fought with the calculated precision of someone who had survived multiple leadership challenges through superior strategy and ruthless exploitation of opponent weaknesses, his vampire abilities enhanced by artifacts that had been collected during centuries of conquest and political maneuvering. Adrian's responses showed the influence of his human connections, his protective instincts towards Sarah and Ethan, creating fighting patterns that prioritized defense over offense in ways that seemed to give his opponent significant advantages during the early phases of their supernatural duel. Adrian's victory came not through superior strength or more devastating attacks, but through his willingness to sacrifice himself to protect the magical wards that shielded Sarah and Ethan from the combat's supernatural fallout. When Count Draven's final assault threatened to breach the protective barriers and expose them to energies that would have been instantly fatal to beings without vampire immunities. His near-death experience triggered a deeper level of the blood awakening that had been dormant since Ethan's initial recognition. The combination of sacrifice and love, creating permanent bonds that transcended normal vampiric relationships to become something unprecedented in supernatural history. The power that flowed through Adrian as he chose protection over victory transformed his vampire nature in ways that enhanced, rather than diminished, his abilities. His connection to Sarah and Ethan becoming a source of strength that allowed him to defeat Count Draven through tactics that had never occurred to the traditionalist faction leader, whose worldview could not accommodate the possibility that human connections might represent evolution rather than weakness. The victory established Adrian's right to rule by vampire law, while demonstrating that his human connections enhanced rather than compromised his power. The traditional challenge system that Count Draven had invoked backfiring when the results showed supernatural authority flowing from love rather than the isolation that vampire culture had always promoted. However, the aftermath also made clear that the supernatural world would never fully accept his chosen family, the victory creating grudging compliance from vampire traditionalists, while failing to address the deeper prejudices that viewed human supernatural relationships as aberrations that threatened the natural order of species separation and hierarchy. Adrian's enhanced abilities and proven leadership did not eliminate the political opposition he faced from those who saw his example as dangerous precedent that could undermine supernatural dominance structures if it spread to other beings who might begin questioning whether their isolation from human society was necessary protection or unnecessary limitation that prevented them from discovering their own potential for redemption through love and service to others. 6 months after the fateful grocery store encounter that had shattered the boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary, a new supernatural order began emerging from the careful negotiations and hard-won truths that had transformed ancient enemies into unlikely allies, working toward shared goals that transcended centuries of mutual hatred and suspicion. Adrian, Sarah, and Ethan established the first integrated supernatural human community in the renovated downtown district, transforming abandoned warehouses and forgotten office buildings into living spaces where beings from different factions could work together under carefully crafted agreements that balanced supernatural needs with human comfort and safety requirements. The community operated under protocols that Sarah had helped design, drawing on her nursing background to create systems that addressed both practical concerns, like feeding schedules for vampires and werewolves, and emotional needs, like the pack bonding requirements that werewolf children needed for healthy development, alongside the solitary reflection periods that young vampires required to process their enhanced senses without becoming overwhelmed by constant stimulation. Ethan, now 5 and growing into his abilities with the natural confidence of a child who had never known a world without magic, served as a living symbol of cooperation between species whose ancient prejudices crumbled in the face of his innocent questions that forced immortal beings to examine beliefs they had never thought to question. His truth sight made deception impossible in his presence, creating an environment where honest communication replaced the political maneuvering that had characterized supernatural diplomacy for millennia, while his influence gradually spread beyond the immediate community to create pockets of peace that expanded like ripples in a pond whenever he interacted with beings who carried his message back to their own factions and territories. Sarah discovered that her role had evolved far beyond simply protecting her son as her powers developed into something unprecedented in supernatural history, her protective instincts transforming into a form of empathic magic that could sense and resolve conflicts before they escalated to the violence that had once seemed inevitable whenever different supernatural factions occupied the same space. Her appointment as the first human representative to the Supernatural Council represented a radical departure from traditions that had excluded mortals from decision-making processes that affected both hidden and human worlds. But her unique perspective and abilities proved invaluable in crafting agreements that respected both mortal and immortal needs without requiring either side to sacrifice their essential nature. The council chambers had been modified to accommodate her presence, with special seating that allowed her to participate in discussions without being overwhelmed by the supernatural energies that flowed constantly between immortal beings during their formal sessions. Her insights into human nature helped bridge gaps that had previously seemed unbridgeable. Her understanding of mortal psychology, providing context for supernatural decisions that would inevitably affect human populations who remained unaware of the hidden world that shaped their daily lives through influences they could neither detect nor comprehend. However, not all factions accepted the new order that threatened to replace familiar conflicts with unprecedented cooperation that required fundamental changes in worldviews that had remained static for centuries or longer. Victoria's entity and its growing network of cultists operated from hidden strongholds scattered throughout the city and beyond. Their patient work focused on corrupting Ethan's influence and returning the supernatural world to its previous state of endless conflict that had provided the chaos and suffering upon which the ancient creature fed for sustenance and growth. The cultists had evolved beyond their original human membership to include supernatural beings who preferred the certainty of eternal warfare to the uncertainty of peace that required constant negotiation and compromise, rather than the simple dominance hierarchies that had governed their species for millennia. Their operations remained largely invisible to the Council's security apparatus, masked by legitimate businesses and charitable organizations that provided perfect cover for activities designed to undermine the fragile alliances that held the new order together through careful balance rather than overwhelming force. The entity's corruption spread through subtle means that avoided direct confrontation while maximizing psychological impact on target populations. Whispered doubts about the sustainability of supernatural cooperation planted in minds already struggling to adapt to changes that challenged everything they had been taught about the nature of reality and their place within it. Former enemies working together created stress that the cultists exploited through carefully timed incidents designed to look like natural conflicts between incompatible species rather than manufactured crises intended to reignite ancient hatreds. Children born into mixed communities faced unique pressures as they navigated identities that encompassed multiple supernatural heritages while trying to find their place in a world that was still learning to accept the possibility that cooperation could produce stronger results than the competition that had driven supernatural evolution for countless generations. Sarah found herself counseling families where vampire and werewolf parents struggled to understand children whose abilities drew from both bloodlines in ways that defied traditional categorization. While Ethan served as an example that such hybrid nature could be a source of strength rather than the confusion and weakness that conservative factions predicted would result from mixing supernatural bloodlines. Victoria's ultimate plan revealed itself as spring equinox approached. The seasonal balance of light and darkness, providing optimal conditions for a ritual that had been centuries in preparation, designed to merge the ancient entity with Ethan in a process that would create an immortal being possessing the child's prophetic power, but guided by the creature's malevolent will toward purposes that served chaos rather than the harmony that genuine prophecy fulfillment was meant to achieve. The ritual required Ethan's willing participation, which Victoria sought to obtain through psychological manipulation that targeted everyone he had grown to love, threatening their safety and happiness in ways designed to convince the child that cooperation would protect those he cared about most deeply. Her approach combined supernatural coercion with emotional blackmail, creating scenarios where Ethan's natural desire to help others became a vulnerability that could be exploited by enemies who understood that his greatest strength was also his most exploitable weakness, when turned against him by those who viewed compassion as a tool for manipulation rather than a genuine expression of care and connection. The final battle erupted across multiple locations simultaneously as Victoria's plan reached its culmination. Supernatural forces arrayed on both sides of a conflict that would determine not just the fate of individual communities, but the future direction of supernatural evolution itself. Adrian and Dante led combined vampire and werewolf forces against Victoria's cultists in physical confrontations that raged through the city's underground tunnels and abandoned districts, their alliance tested by combat that required unprecedented cooperation between species whose fighting styles and tactical approaches had been developed specifically for warfare against each other. Meanwhile, Sarah faced the greater challenge of protecting Ethan in the spiritual realm where the actual ritual unfolded. Her protective abilities stretched to their limits as she navigated magical landscapes that existed beyond normal reality, while maintaining the emotional connection that anchored her son's identity against the entity's attempts to overwhelm his consciousness with visions of power and control that could reshape both worlds according to its ancient hunger for conflict and suffering. Celeste and her witch allies worked desperately to unravel centuries of magical preparation that Victoria had woven around the city like a web designed to channel supernatural energies toward the equinox ritual, their counterspells requiring precise timing and flawless execution because any error would allow the accumulated power to achieve critical mass and complete the merger regardless of physical battle outcomes. The magical infrastructure that supported the ritual had been disguised as urban development projects and historical preservation efforts, landmarks and public buildings serving as focal points for energies that most humans dismissed as architectural aesthetics, while supernatural beings recognized the sophisticated network of power channeling that had been constructed over decades of patient planning. The witch's task was complicated by the entity's foresight in creating multiple backup systems and redundant pathways that meant disabling the ritual required simultaneously disrupting magical flows at dozens of locations throughout the metropolitan area, while maintaining their own protective spells against cultists who targeted them specifically to prevent their interference, with the culmination of centuries of careful preparation. Sarah's confrontation with the entity-possessed Victoria became deeply personal when the creature revealed its role in David's death. The admission that it had marked their family bloodline decades ago and orchestrated the car accident that had taken her husband, adding emotional weight to her determination that transcended simple maternal protection to become a quest for justice that had been delayed by years of grief and confusion. The revelation that David had died protecting secrets he had discovered about their supernatural heritage transformed her understanding of their relationship, his obsessive genealogical research revealed as desperate attempts to understand and prepare for threats that he could sense but not clearly identify without supernatural knowledge that had been deliberately concealed from their family line. The entity's taunting explanations of how it had manipulated events to isolate Sarah and make her more vulnerable to supernatural influence when Ethan's abilities finally manifested added layers of rage to her protective instincts, her power responding to emotional intensity by reaching levels that surprised even Celeste, who had thought she understood the full scope of Sarah's unprecedented abilities. The battle reached its climax when the entity offered Ethan ultimate power over both supernatural and human realms, promising to end all conflicts through dominance that would eliminate the need for negotiation and compromise by establishing clear hierarchies with him at the apex of supernatural authority. For a moment, the child wavered as visions showed him futures where his commands could prevent all suffering through absolute control, where his will could reshape reality to eliminate poverty, war, and injustice through magical force that rendered human agency irrelevant compared to benevolent supernatural guidance. But Ethan's innocent wisdom recognized the fundamental flaw in the entity's offer, understanding instinctively that power imposed from above could never create the genuine cooperation that came from beings choosing to work together despite their differences and conflicting interests. His rejection of the entity's temptation took the form of a conscious choice to strengthen the bonds between his chosen family and allies, rather than accept authority that would isolate him from the relationships that gave his life meaning and purpose. The power that flowed from Ethan's choice channeled itself through every connection he had formed since that first moment of recognition in the grocery store, his innocent faith in love over power becoming the key to victory that demonstrated the prophecy's true meaning had never been about ruling through supernatural authority, but about inspiring others to choose cooperation over conflict through example rather than coercion. The entity's defeat came not through destruction, but through transformation, its hunger for chaos satisfied by the discovery that creating rather than destroying could provide even greater sources of energy when channeled toward purposes that served all participants rather than the narrow interests of individual factions seeking dominance over their competitors and enemies. Victoria's liberation from possession left her weakened but genuine for the first time in decades, her natural personality emerging from beneath centuries of supernatural manipulation to reveal someone capable of redemption through acknowledgement of the damage she had caused and willingness to work toward repairing relationships that had been corrupted by the entity's influence. 1 year later, the Supernatural Integration Program had expanded to cities worldwide, as other communities recognized the success of the downtown district experiment and requested assistance in establishing their own mixed populations where different species could coexist peacefully while maintaining their distinct cultural identities and biological needs. Ethan attended a special school where young beings from different supernatural backgrounds learned together under curriculum designed by Sarah and Celeste to address both practical skills, like controlling enhanced abilities, and social skills, like communication across species barriers, that had historically prevented cooperation between natural enemies. Adrian and Sarah worked together to establish legal frameworks that protected both human and supernatural rights through carefully crafted legislation that acknowledged the hidden world's existence while maintaining the secrecy that prevented panic and persecution from human populations not yet ready to accept the reality of their supernatural neighbors. The family dynamic that had emerged from crisis and conflict evolved naturally into something that felt both extraordinary and completely normal. Adrian embracing both fatherhood and partnership with Sarah, while maintaining his responsibilities as vampire king through a governing style that emphasized consensus building over traditional authoritarian command structures. Sarah found purpose in her role as a bridge builder, whose unique perspective and abilities helped other mixed families navigate the supernatural world while maintaining connections to their human heritage that provided stability and emotional grounding for children whose abilities might otherwise overwhelm their developing personalities. Ethan demonstrated the prophecy's ultimate fulfillment, not as a ruler imposing peace through power, but as a catalyst whose presence inspired others to choose cooperation over conflict through example and encouragement, rather than supernatural compulsion or political pressure. His sixth birthday party represented a milestone that would have been impossible just 2 years earlier. Werewolf cubs playing alongside young witches, while vampire children shared games with human classmates under supervision that included parents from every supernatural faction who had learned to trust each other through shared investment in their children's futures. The celebration took place in the community center that had been built where the grocery store once stood. The transformation of that ordinary space into something magical, serving as a symbol for the broader changes that had rippled outward from one child's innocent recognition of family connection that transcended species barriers and ancient prejudices. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as Adrian taught Ethan to tend their garden, both vampire and child laughing as they worked together in the evening light that cast golden shadows across vegetables and flowers that grew with supernatural vitality in soil enriched by magic and tended with love that had overcome every obstacle placed in its path by those who feared change more than they valued growth. The scene mirrored but transformed the opening grocery store encounter that had begun their journey. What started as a moment of innocent recognition, having grown into a family built on choice rather than fate, their bonds strengthened by trials that might have destroyed relationships based on convenience or political necessity, rather than genuine affection and mutual respect. The quiet domesticity of the moment contained within it all the struggles and victories that had brought them to this point, their peaceful evening routine representing the ultimate triumph over forces that had sought to prevent supernatural beings from discovering that love could enhance, rather than diminish their power when channeled toward protective purposes rather than domination and control. Future challenges remained as other supernatural communities around the world requested Ethan's help in resolving their own conflicts, while new prophecies spoke of other bridge children yet to be born, who would continue the work of healing ancient wounds between species that had forgotten their common origins, in favor of competing for resources and territory that could be shared more effectively through cooperation than hoarded through conflict. David's research notebooks revealed references to other hidden supernatural bloodlines that suggested their story was part of a larger pattern of change that would continue growing long beyond their personal narrative. His sacrifice having protected not just his immediate family, but knowledge that could help others find their own path toward the integration that Ethan had made possible through his innocent faith, that love was stronger than fear, and that choosing to trust could create miracles that force could never achieve through dominance over willing hearts and minds.